I call Todd Muller.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to be able to stand here tonight and take a call in the first reading of the Social Housing Reform Transaction Mandate Bill. Mr Speaker, I'm excited because this finally enables reform of our social housing provision in this country to widen it more comprehensively beyond state provision only, to facilitate more community housing provision, more collaboration, greater innovation in the models around that delivery, and in the end, greater outcomes for those who need it most, Mr Speaker, our vulnerable New Zealanders, our customers, as we heard this afternoon from Bill English. Mr Speaker, if ever there was an insight as to why this bill is needed, it was the opportunity that was afforded to me a month or so ago when I was asked to attend a community housing hui in Maryvale in Tauranga, where 50 locals from that community had been pulled together to hear about this bill in particular and this particular policy reform. And I had the privilege of outlining the position from the perspective of the government, but there were 4 others who were in the room representing Labour and Greens and New Zealand First and even Mana Party, Mr Speaker. And it was extraordinary the level of blind ideology that was imparted by the 4 parties that I mentioned, Labour, Green, New Zealand First and Mana. And what was even worse is that the people in that room were nearly all clients of Housing New Zealand, who had all come to hear what it would mean for them, and the language and the narrative that was used by the Labour and Green and New Zealand First representatives was appalling. They were told that they would be kicked out of their houses. They were told that this was a dirty deal between Housing New Zealand and community housing providers, that billions and billions of dollars worth of housing stock was going to be sold off. And, Mr Speaker, what was particularly revealing from my perspective was that they said, speaker after speaker, a philosophical view that only the government through Housing New Zealand provision knows what's best for Maryvale and Tauranga. Only the government through Housing New Zealand should be the provider of state houses in that community. Mr Speaker, it was appalling in my view. It was a deliberate exercise in making vulnerable people feel more vulnerable through distorting deliberately what this policy is all about. But the Labour Party have form in this, Mr Speaker, because in 2008, they wrote to every Housing New Zealand tenant with Labour Party letterhead and said, and saying, if you vote for National, you'll get kicked out of your house. That's what they do, the Labour Party. Right. They say they represent the most vulnerable, but they use them for their own political purpose, and it's outrageous, and it was fantastic to be able to stand there and give an effective, hopefully an effective outline of why this policy is important, why we are delivering for the people of Tauranga and Maryvale, Mr Speaker. So after the kai, we always appropriately have a kai at half-time, I had the opportunity to reinforce some key messages, Mr Speaker, around our commitment to have over 60,000 state houses by 2017, our commitment for an additional 3,000 income-related rent subsidies by 2017, our commitment for housing provision to remain as long as the need is genuine, and we will stand beside those people in their time of need. But most critically, Mr Speaker, I could talk to our commitment that does not arrogantly assume that only Housing New Zealand should play a part in social housing provision, but that together with community housing providers who are from the community, who live in the community, that live its challenges and understand its opportunities, together we can achieve more. And, Mr Speaker, this is what this bill enables and why I'm so proud to be able to stand here and support it. Mr Speaker, obviously the key provisions for this bill supports our social housing program. It amends the Housing Corporation Act to provide designated ministers with the authority to transfer Housing New Zealand corporation properties, and they will be able to do that, these designated ministers, by entering into appropriate commercial contracts in the name of Housing New Zealand. And it was interesting to hear Mr Twyford argue, I think ineffectively, that that somehow that this is an overreach in terms of ministerial power. I think it's absolutely appropriate. Housing New Zealand, under current legislation, would be difficult for the government to direct via policy intent particular houses to be to be sold on behalf of the state. This bill enables the ministers to be able to enter into those various contractual negotiations. And we heard earlier from Minister Bennett around the importance of the transparency provisions that are implicit here through the gazetting notice, the fact that we have to demonstrate at all times that these transfers are consistent with our social housing reform objectives, Mr Speaker. So, Mr Speaker, this enables us to sell between 1,000 and 2,000 houses to community providers over the next year. And of course, as noted, the ministers can only use this power if it is consistent with one or more of the social housing reform program objectives set out in the legislation. And these are worth just stepping through, Mr Speaker, because they are critical to the bill. First, ensure that people who need housing support can access it and receive social housing services that meet their needs. Secondly, ensure that social housing is of the right size, configuration and quality, and in the right areas for those households which need it. And we have heard from my esteemed colleague, Matt Ducey, the fantastic MP for Waimakariri earlier, around the mismatch at the moment between demand and supply. Demand, 25% of demand for one bedroom, only 9% of the supply exists in that space. The opposite, of course, for three bedroom, 24% of the demand, but just under half, 43% of supply. The configuration isn't what we need, Mr Speaker, and working with community housing providers will enable that to occur more easily. Mr Speaker, I'm very pleased that Tauranga, in particular, has been selected as an area to work with our local community and community housing providers for some stock transfer. Obviously, Mr Speaker, we have 5 community housing providers in Tauranga. There's the Tauranga Community Housing Trust, and interesting, Mr Speaker, only a matter of a month or two ago, Minister Bennett was in Tauranga and opening a particular local social housing initiative that was put together by the Tauranga Community Housing Trust. Why was that so important and relevant here? The same footprint, Mr Speaker, twice as many houses provided, all insulated, all warm, and all delivering to the mixed needs of that particular community. Ngāti Ranganui, as we heard over the last 48 hours, I've been obviously involved and have 115 right of first refusals. The country's biggest non-government social housing provider are keen to buy houses in Tauranga. 2 iwi organisations, Ngā Potiki and Mangatawa, are keen to participate and have a fantastic vision that not only provides phenomenal opportunities for social housing for their iwi, but the wider community, particularly in Papamoa. So for the opposition to stand up there, as they have today, and say that this is all about a philosophical view which is not connected with the community, that there is no demand, it is absolute patent nonsense, Mr Speaker. They need to get out of Wellington, they need to come up to Tauranga, they need to talk to the people that they purport to represent, who are lining up and saying they want to be a part of that, they have a vision for their community, and they think in this government, not the Labor government, in this government, they have a government they can partner with that is innovative, that is open, that will facilitate the delivery of their community housing needs. And Mr Speaker, I look forward to supporting this bill through the Select Committee. I hope we get some good debate around the bill, and I very much commend it to the House.